Hey, let's pray, and then we'll get into the Word. We'll get into it. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this evening, the great meal that we had, the good time of fellowship we've had. Father, I pray that our study tonight will just be enlightening for us, that you'll show us the truth of your Word, that our spirits and our spiritual eyes and ears will be open to what you have to say to us tonight. Father, I just pray that what we say and do is glorifying and honoring to you in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Well, after tonight, we will be halfway through this book. Aren't you thrilled? Wow. Wow. Only 21 more chapters of Job to go. I think chapter 20 may be one of the darkest chapters of Job. It may not be, a lot of them are, but this one just really struck me as dark. Eliphaz and Bildad, they've been mean and offensive in what they've had to say. But I think old Zophar here, I think he crosses the line in this chapter. And, I mean, he's cruel, but he just really goes off the deep end, I think. And thankfully, this is the last time we're going to hear from Zophar. This chapter, and he's done. We don't hear from him anymore. He not only becomes toxic in his treatment of Job, but he actually sets himself up as a prophet, because he predicts Job's violent death, the destruction of his house. He talks about the rising up of heaven and earth as witness against Job for his wicked and hypocritical lifestyle. And he even called later on in the chapter. So I think Zophar gives us a good example of someone who has decided that God is angry with a fellow believer. And somewhere along the line, they got themselves convinced that they're God's instrument to manifest that anger to that person. You know, he sets himself up as speaking for God. And, of course, the others have done it too, but Zophar really, really gets wild here. So let's read the first 3 verses of chapter 20. Then Zophar the Naamathite answered and said, "Therefore my anxious thoughts make me answer, because of the turmoil within me. I have heard the rebuke that reproaches me, and the spirit of my understanding causes me to answer." Zophar actually, he says he's insulted by the fact that Job doesn't accept his argument that sin is always judged by God in this lifetime that you live, and that suffering is a sign that Job has sinned. And because of Job's reluctance and resistance to what he has to say, Zophar admits that he's impatient with what he says, and he's insulted in his spirit. But look at verses 2 and 3, and based on what he says there, where is Zophar's concern actually directed? Who's he really concerned with? Absolutely right. He is more concerned about himself than he is with Job. By his own testimony, he's speaking from his own thoughts and his own feelings with absolutely no direction from God. He talks about his anxious thoughts. Do anxious thoughts come from God? No, absolutely not. And the turmoil within himself in verse 2. And he says he's offended by Job's rebuke. Well, he should be offended by Job's rebuke, because Job's right and he's wrong. He's just not willing to admit it. Like Bildad and Eliphaz, Zophar was just simply determined to convince Job that his judgment was infallible, that he couldn't possibly be wrong. Job, you know, you're the guy that's wrong. I know what I'm talking about. Now, beginning with verse 4 and on through the rest of the chapter, we get Zophar's final words, but it's nothing more than a repetition of what I called last week his Forrest Gump theology. Wicked is as wicked does, and the wicked are always punished in this life. You know, that's what Zophar is all about. So let's read verses 4 through 11. Do you not know this of old, since man was placed on earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite is but for a moment? Though his haughtiness mounts up to the heavens, and his head reaches to the clouds, yet he will perish forever like his own refuse. Those who have seen him will say, where is he? He will fly away like a dream and not be found. Yes, he will be chased away like a vision of the night. The eye that saw him will see him no more, nor will his place behold him any more. His children will seek the favor of the poor, and his hands will restore his wealth. His bones are full of his youthful vigor, but it will lie down with him in the dust. When I first looked at this chapter last week, before Pastor preached on Sunday, you know, I told you about the counseling session I had to have with Pastor the week before because he was stealing my notes. Well, he paid me back this Sunday. You know, when I was reading verse 4, initially I just kind of blew past it. It seemed to me a question that had been asked and answered before. But as Pastor was preaching this Sunday and talking about man's wisdom versus God's wisdom, boy, did my mind go back to Zophar here. Zophar asks what appears to be a question. He says, do you not know this of old, since man was placed on earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite is but for a moment? That sounds like a simple question until you think about it in terms of what James had to say. Zophar isn't looking for an answer here. He doesn't want an answer here. What he's doing is actually using a question to make a statement, which some people do. And the statement that he's making is the statement that both Eliphaz and Bildad have both said, and now he says it. He says, look, we've seen this time and time again. You know, history is on our side. We know what we're talking about. We have more wisdom than you do, so you should follow our advice. You know, everybody knows this, Joe. Don't you know from history that we're right and you're wrong? That's what he's saying. And if you think about what Pastor Ted said Sunday, and if you don't think about it, go back and watch it because it's a powerful sermon. You know, what James says in chapter 3, verses 13 and following accurately describes Zophar here. What did James say in 13 and 14? I'm going to tell you. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Now, have Job's three friends ever demonstrated any meekness of wisdom in what they've said to this point? Any. None whatsoever. None. They've all done what? They've boasted about their superior knowledge, and they've lied by misapplying the truth. You know, and they did this because what they really wanted to do was win the argument with Job. That's what they wanted to do because they were self-seeking in their heart. It's what James was talking about. And so what does James say about where that kind of wisdom comes from? Absolutely. He said in James 3:15 and 16, this wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. If the wisdom that Job's friends claim to have was actually from God, then Job, and we for that matter, would easily recognize it because, as James says in verse 17, it would be what? It would be first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. The exact opposite of everything that Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz have done. The exact opposite. I don't believe that there's any doubt at this point that Satan was their number one cheerleader, sowing confusion and every evil thing in their minds in order to get Job to do what he originally charged him with: curse God and die. That was their whole purpose. And Zophar actually calls Job a hypocrite for standing firm in his principles and belief in verse 5, where he says, the joy of the hypocrite is but for a moment. Job, you've had your joy. It's over. You need to admit it. If you don't, you're just a hypocrite. Zophar is another example for us of someone who becomes so intent on proving their point that they begin to embellish their facts so that a generality becomes an irreversible absolute. You ever known anybody to do that? Yeah. Yeah, take facts and turn them around to the way I want them. And, well, this is what Zophar does. We're going to see this in verses 12 through 19 as he describes the punishment of the wicked in this life as being an absolute with no way of escape. So, verses 12 through 19. Though evil is sweet in his mouth, and he hides it under his tongue, though he spares it and does not forsake it, but still keeps it in his mouth, yet his food in his stomach turns sour. It becomes cobra venom within him. He swallows down riches and vomits them up again. God casts them out of his belly. He will suck the poison of cobras. The viper's tongue will slay him. He will not see the streams, the rivers flowing with honey and cream. He will restore that for which he labored and will not swallow it down. From the proceeds of business he will get no enjoyment. For he has oppressed and forsaken the poor. He has violently seized a house which he did not build. I told you it was a dark chapter. And I'm sorry we ate before I read that passage. But, it just is what it is. Zophar tells Job that although the wicked man might enjoy things for a while, there is no doubt that God brings judgment against him so that everyone can see. Now, here again, we see that while Zophar may be right theologically, he's wrong spiritually because he's wrong in his basic assumptions about God and about Job. But Zophar doesn't really care about that because Zophar is setting the stage now. He's going to actually make a specific charge against Job in this passage right here. And well, he doesn't name Job by name, but I don't think there's any doubt about who he is describing in his mind. Now, has there been any indication to this point that Zophar or Bildad or Eliphaz or anyone else for that matter has actually witnessed any sin on Job's part? No, not at all. No indication that anyone has witnessed Job's ill treatment of anyone or that he's committed any other sin, but that doesn't stop old Zophar from projecting sin where sin has yet to be found. And he doesn't just assume presence of sin, but he makes a specific charge. Look at verse 19. What is he saying about Job? Now, as I said, he doesn't name Job, but this whole chapter, he's addressing Job, and everything. He doesn't have the intestinal fortitude to name Job, but that's exactly who he's talking about here. So, what does he say Job has done? Mistreated the poor, and what else? He even says he stole somebody's house with violence. Wow. That's what he's implying, that Job has oppressed and forsaken the poor and violently stolen someone's house. Zophar describes what he thought was the sinful conduct of a wicked man and why he deserved to be punished. Now, in the final passage, Zophar says that because Job is going through this time of suffering, having lost his children, lost his wealth, and with all these awful boils breaking out all over him, it's clearly obvious to everybody, Job, that you're just a sinner. And that's what he's talking about. That's what he's talked about to this point. That's what he's going to continue to talk about as we go through verses 20 through 29. Because he knows no quietness in his heart, he will not save anything he desires. Nothing is left for him to eat. Therefore, his well-being will not last. In his self-sufficiency, he will be in distress. Every hand of misery will come against him. When he is about to fill his stomach, God will cast on him the fury of his wrath, and will rain it on him while he is eating. He will flee from the iron weapon. A bronze bow will pierce him through. It is drawn and comes out of the body. Yes, the glittering point comes out of his gall. Terrors come upon him. Total darkness is reserved for his treasures. An unfanned fire will consume him. It shall go ill with him who is left in his tent. This took me back to the first chapter of Job. When Job's friends first arrived on the scene, we talked about how they came and they just sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights. And what a show of respect that was for Job. And maybe it was. It could, I'll concede a little bit of respect. But as I thought about it, I wonder if they were really just sitting and waiting for Job to fess up. We're just going to wait and see if you'll just admit it, Job. We're going to give you just as much time as you want. We're going to sit here and do it. Now that we have heard from all three of his friends, it seems kind of obvious to me that these guys came with their preconceived ideas of what Job needed to do to make things right. Because there's not a word of mercy or tenderness or hope from them to Job. Everything they have said to Job to this point has been unkind, cruel, vicious, judgmental. They haven't been concerned about him at all. But from their perspective, they were simply trying to help Job see that he's a sinner. Job, we just want to help you, friend. You're a sinner. Just admit it. Wow. Now, the other side of the coin, one might say that, or ask, or say that Job provoked this judgment and condemnation. How did he do that? When he absolutely refused to give in to their demands, and follow their advice. They told him what he needed to do, and he said, I don't need to do that. And they didn't like that. They got offended. They got angry. And they just kept saying mean things to Job. Verse 28, Zophar, I think, is describing Job's losses. And then he makes the connection in verse 29 that Job was this stubborn, wicked man who deserved judgment from God. And look at that phrase, and his goods will flow away. What does that tell us about Zophar? And his goods will flow away. What was Zophar concerned about? Say it louder, Chad. He was concerned about Zophar, and he was concerned about stuff, physical, what he could see physically, not what he could see spiritually. He was focused entirely on the material aspect of Job's troubles. He ignored the spiritual aspect of it. He considers Job's loss of his possessions and physical stuff as judgment from God. But the loss of fellowship, or the potential loss of fellowship from God, doesn't even occur to Zophar. He says nothing about it. But it's precisely that loss of fellowship with God that Job was concerned about. Job wasn't concerned about his stuff. Job was concerned about his spiritual relationship with the God whom he knew. There's a lot about God that he didn't know, and that's what he questions in here. He said, I don't understand this. Everything I thought I knew about God doesn't line up with what I'm going through. Job is seeking spiritual enlightenment here. All his friends want is physical restoration of health and wealth. That's the big difference. You know, Zophar is convinced that he knows more about God than anybody else. Back in chapter 11, if you recall, he told Job that his spirit was in the wrong place, his mind was in the wrong place, and his heart was in the wrong place. Now in chapter 20, Zophar is essentially telling Job, you're reaping what you've sown. That's really what he's saying to him here in this chapter. You know, as I said, this is really a dark chapter, and this guy is really just gone off the deep end. But it's important to notice that we see the narrow-mindedness and the rigidity of Zophar's belief in that what he says from the first time he spoke to now contains no hint of that the wicked might repent, might make amends with God, and gain favor with God. None. You know, Zophar has no compassion, and in his mind, his God has no mercy. No, none whatsoever. None. Yeah. Questions about Zophar? Said he ain't a nice guy, and I'm glad we don't hear from him anymore. Really. And, well, no, I won't even go there, because God, Zophar gets his comeuppance from God, as do Bildad and Eliphaz later on in the book. In chapter 21, we have Job's reply, rather logical reply. You know, now there's times that Job speaks rather sharply to his friends. Other times, maybe because the pain isn't as intense, he's able to speak more calmly and objectively. I think this is one of those chapters. Job wants to answer his friends' arguments, and so he begins with an appeal for them to listen carefully to his speech. So we're going to read the first 16 verses of 21. Then Job answered and said, listen carefully to my speech, and let this be your consolation. Bear with me that I may speak, and after I have spoken, keep mocking. As for me, is my complaint against man? And if it were, why should I not be impatient? Look at me and be astonished. Put your hand over your mouth. Even when I remember, I am terrified, and trembling takes hold of my flesh. Why do the wicked live and become old? Yes, become mighty in power. Their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, neither is the rod of God upon them. Their bull breeds without failure, their cow calves without miscarriage. They send forth their little ones like a flock, and their children dance. They sing to the tambourine and harp, and rejoice to the sound of the flute. They spend their days in wealth, and in a moment go down to the grave. Yet they say to God, depart from us, for we do not desire the knowledge of your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit do we have if we pray to him? Indeed, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me. Job begins by basically telling his friends that if they can't help him, at least they can listen to him. You know, and it would help if they would just listen to what he has to say. That would be of some consolation to him if you just listen to him. And what he says in verse 4, if you look at that again, demonstrates that Job understands that his personal crisis was fundamentally spiritual in nature. More than being a medical or an economic or a social crisis or a family crisis. He says, and as for me, is my complaint against man? If it were, why should I not be impatient? You know, he knows his argument's not against man. You know, his problem is with God and his belief system. And he's dealing with that. And because of the way Job's friends just keep repeating their same old tired arguments, it's kind of easy to see that Job would feel that they weren't listening to him. And Job wanted to prove that he had been listening to them, and he did this by doing what they had tried to do to him. He takes their words and turns them back on themselves. I'll give you a few examples. Zophar said the wicked die young in chapter 20, verse 11. He said, his bones are full of his youthful vigor, but it will lie down with him in the dust. Job says in verse 7 here, why do the wicked live and become old? Yes, and become mighty in power. Bildad told Job in chapter 18, verse 19, that a wicked man has neither son nor posterity among his people, nor any remaining in his dwellings. Job tells him that's not true in verse 8, where he says, their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes. And he said they just keep reproducing like rabbits. And, you know, they're animals. They're successful in reproducing. And in 18, verse 5, Bildad says, the light of the wicked indeed goes out, and the flame of his fire does not shine. And I love Job's response to that in verse 17 when he says, hey, Bildad, how often is the lamp of the wicked put out? How often does their destruction come upon them? The sorrows God distributes in his anger. Show me. I'm from Missouri, which was in the southern part of wherever they live. You know, show me. Yeah. You know, now in the following verses, Job explains many of the blessings, and he did that in the verses we just read as well, that seem to come to the wicked, even as they reject God. He says, why pray to God? We don't profit from it, you know, and say, God, just get away from us and leave us alone. That's what the wicked are doing, Job says, and yet they still prosper. So how can you say to me that I'm wicked? You haven't seen me do anything wicked. You know? Wow. Job argues in verses 14 through 16 that the wicked live their entire life and nothing ever seems to trouble them. And I dare say we've all probably known people like that, you know, in this life. Absolutely. You know, what we have here is a classic that's not fair argument. And that's what Job is essentially saying. Have you ever said that's not fair about anything? Yeah. You know, there's a lot of Christians today that have that same feeling. You know, we see people whom we think should be feeling the judgment of God, but they're not. And then we go through a little bit of difficulty, and we feel like we're getting punished by God. We say, that's not fair, God. You know, I go to church every Sunday. I tithe. I pray. I visit the sick. I do all this stuff, and yet you putting this on me? Yeah. But Joe Dokes that lives next door, you know, he comes home drunk every night. He beats his wife. He mistreats his kids, and yet he's got 3 cars, a boat, a house bigger than mine, and makes more money. That's not fair, you know. Really. Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. So we have this question of fairness from God. So let's talk about fairness for a minute. What does fairness mean? It doesn't mean fairness of complexion, okay? So I'll beat you to that one. So what does fairness mean? When you use that term or when you hear it, what do you think of? Okay. What else? Consequences fitting to the act. That's good. Yeah. You get what you deserve. Okay. Anything else? Good stuff. Fairness means impartial and just treatment or behavior without favoritism or discrimination. The quality of making judgments that are free from discrimination. So, is God fair? Say it louder. That's one verse. You got a verse for me, Janet? You're right. Absolutely right. Yeah. 2 synonyms for fairness are just and impartial. Okay? Both the Old Testament and the New Testament are unequivocal that God is just and impartial. I'm just going to give you a couple of verses from each. Deuteronomy 32:4. He is the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. And 2 Chronicles 19:7. Now therefore, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Take care and do it, for there is no iniquity with the Lord our God, no partiality, nor taking of bribes. You ever try to bribe God? We all have at some point in time or another. We do. Yeah. And Paul wrote in Romans 2:11, for there is no partiality with God. There is no partiality. And Peter of all people, I love what he did. Standing in that Gentile's home, seeing the work of the Holy Spirit, what does he say in Acts 10:34? In truth, I perceive there is no partiality with God. Same thing that Paul said. Paul and Peter. God is eminently fair. He treats no one wrongly because he's impartial, he's honest, and he's just. If we had a picture of God, it ought to appear in the dictionary beside all of those words. Just, yeah, God. Fair, yeah, God. That's him. He personifies those things. Absolutely. Well, in the next passage, Job points out that he thinks God's judgment is kind of rendered somewhat infrequently. But he gets over himself real quick. Don't jump to conclusions. Let's read 17 through 21 of chapter 21. How often is the lamp of the wicked put out? How often does their destruction come upon them? The sorrows God distributes in his anger. They are like straw before the wind, and like chaff that a storm carries away. They say, God lays up one's iniquity for his children. Let him recompense him that he may know it. Let his eyes see his destruction, and let him drink of the wrath of the Almighty. For what does he care about his household after him, when the number of his months is cut in half? To his own question, how often is the lamp of the wicked put out? Now, he was actually focusing that to Zophar, but I think if Job were to answer that question, he would say, not often enough, really, because that's what Zophar said the opposite. He said, hey, it always happens. And Job said, really? I don't think quite enough, really. Job acknowledged that wickedness was never ultimately rewarded and was always punished in the end. If not in this life, certainly in whatever the life to come was like. But the problem for Job was that it never seemed to be soon enough. Job was suffering now. And he knew he hadn't done anything. And he didn't understand why others could be obviously and openly sinning and wicked and not suffer now. That was his problem. Not only did they not suffer, they prospered. And he talks about how they prospered here. And in continuing this same line of thought, in the next passage, Job acknowledges that God is all-wise, but he also says the wicked sometimes prosper, and godly people sometimes prosper. So I think, 21 to 26 is our next passage. Nope, 22, 26. Can anyone teach God knowledge, since he judges those on high? One dies in his full strength, being wholly at ease and secure. His pails are full of milk, and the marrow of his bones is moist. Another man dies in the bitterness of his soul, never having eaten with pleasure. They lie down alike in the dust, and worms cover them. Look, I know your thoughts. That's as far as we're going there. I get carried away sometimes when I'm reading it. Verse 22, what do you think? That verse, can anyone teach God knowledge, since he judges those on high? What do you think that's telling us about Job? Anything? Are you picking up on any kind of spiritual growth in what Job is saying there? Yeah. You know, I believe that we're seeing more evidence of spiritual growth here. Now, in the broader context, Job is certainly questioning the ways and wisdom of God in not bringing judgment sooner upon the wicked man. Job's questioning that. But at the same time, he senses that what he was questioning was wrong, that he shouldn't be doing that, and he corrects himself with his own rhetorical question. And that's what he's doing here, I think, in verse 22. He's clearly uncomfortable in questioning the ways and the wisdom of God, but at the same time, it just seems so unfair to him that the good and the bad would seemingly have the same end. One lives a righteous life, one lives an unrighteous life. They both die, and what happens? They're eaten by worms. You know? Wow. the same thing. And you know, he just struggles with that. And do we not struggle with that same thought today? We absolutely do. We absolutely do. Now, sure. Yes, please. Great. Yeah. 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 Uh-huh. Yeah. And you know, that's a great point, because that's where we're going to see when Job finally gets his hearing before God, and God just says a few words, and what's the first thing Job does? He said, I'll put my hand over my mouth and I'll shut up, because he knows. He knows. And I think we're seeing that gradual increase in spiritual knowledge from Job. You know, he's learning things about God that he had no concept of before. Yeah, absolutely. He knows that his Redeemer lives. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, from 27 to the end of the chapter, Job's going to tell his friends, just leave their empty words alone. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah. You know, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right, Chad. Great point. Okay, 27 and following. Look, I know your thoughts and the schemes with which you would wrong me. For you say, where is the house of the prince? And where is the tent, the dwelling place of the wicked? Have you not asked those who travel the road? And do you not know their signs? For the wicked are reserved for the day of doom. They shall be brought out on the day of wrath, who condemns his way to his face, and who repays him for what he has done. Yet he shall be brought to the grave, and a vigil kept over the tomb. The clods of the valley shall be sweet to him. Everyone shall follow him, as countless have gone before him. How then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers? As Job dared to question God in the preceding verses, I think he could probably look at the expression on his friends' faces and see that they were appalled that he would speak in such a manner. You know, both Job and his friends didn't understand God's ways, but there's two significant differences between Job and his friends. You know, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar confidently claimed that they did understand. And they confidently claimed that Job did not understand. But Job admitted to his confusion and lack of understanding. Those guys wouldn't admit to anything. They knew the answers. Job said, I don't know the answers. I need some answers here. And secondly, Job's friends, they just thought these were simply matters of theological and moral theory, good topics for discussion, but that was it. But for Job, these were life and death issues and questions that he had in his mind. He tells his friends then that, look, if you'll just ask around, there's caravans coming through here all the time. Ask the traveling salesman, the people that get out and see what's going on in the world. You'll discover that they support what I'm saying, not what you're saying. Job says that there is no doubt that the wicked often escape disaster in this life. And it's not only true here, it's true everywhere. It's true everywhere. The wicked live above the law, he says. Nobody tells them they're doing wrong. They get by with it, and then what happens? They die highly honored, and their graves are adorned and guarded. Wow. It's the afterlife where they pay, Well, Job concludes this second round of verbal exchanges with a strong statement that his friends can't comfort him with empty words and lies in verse 34. I mean, he just hits them right between the running lights. He says, what you say is worthless and it's lies. Job could see through their wrong theology. And, they had a theology that didn't align with his experience. And that's where the problem was for these guys. Job's friends represent people, and there's a lot of them around today, who have God in a box. Absolutely. They have what they think is a clear understanding of all the ways that God works, and they think they can predict how he's going to act. But when he acts in a way that they don't understand and don't expect, they got no way of handling it. Because it's their theology that they've got faith in and not God. I've got all the answers. I don't need God. I know what God's going to do. And that's essentially what these guys are saying to Job. And this is what Job is learning about his own theology. It's been demolished by his experience. As I've said before, prior to this time of suffering that Job's going through, he lived a great life. He was probably the most respected man in the country. And I dare say his theology was probably very much like these guys. But he had a relationship with God that these three guys didn't have and don't have. And that's the difference. Job is willing to have his spiritual eyes and ears open, and he's trying to hear from God. God hasn't spoken to him yet, but he's going to. But Job is learning, and he's seeing things. His old theology has been filed in the round file over in the corner. It's just there. Put it with the ashes. That's where it stays. Someone once said that a man with true experience is never at the mercy of a man with just an argument. You think about that. That's what Job's doing. His friends have nothing but an argument. Job's got an experience. And you can't take that experience away from Job. That's what he's learning from. So, this concludes the second round of the verbal war, and it concludes the first half of the book. Only 21 more chapters. 21 more chapters. Yeah, it is. And we only hear, other than Job, we only hear from, Eliphaz is introduced to us in this part of the book. We're going to hear from Bildad, not Eliphaz, Elihu is introduced to us, Elihu. We're going to hear from Bildad, and I think we hear from Eliphaz too, but I'm not sure. I haven't looked that far ahead yet, but I know we hear from old Bildad again. They have less and less to say, and Job has more and more. Job goes on, Elihu goes on for 5 chapters. Yeah, I mean, who can speak for 5 chapters? I can't even do it in the time we have here. Well, yeah, he is the youngest of the bunch, Chad. You're right. And boy, I think so. Yeah. He's got to play catch. I only get one shot at this, so I'm going to take it and do it all. Yeah, okay. Questions, comments about Job? I know You know, we cover a lot of territory in 2 chapters in a night, but you know, these guys are saying the same thing over and over and over again, and you can find nuggets in there, and that's what I try to dig out, is where the good stuff is, and just let the ash and trash lay, because that's what it is. You know, it's in God's Word for a reason, and we need to read it, and it keeps things in context when we look at it that way, and that's what's important, is context in the Word. So, yes, sir. Yeah. 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 Yeah.